Hey all, you are listening to part 2 of a 2-part episode. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, go ahead and pull over in your forklift or your mech suit or whatever it is that you're currently driving while you're listening to podcasts, and listen to that one first, because you can't listen to part 2 of a 2-part series first, you dingus. Hope you enjoy it.
So now we're going to get to the crowning element of this list we gave you, which is the spices. The spices were crucial. The spices were a huge motivator or incentive for the Dutch going anywhere overseas, as well as
through space.
Through space and time. Yep.
It must flow.
Yes, exactly.
Etc.
It must flow. The spice must flow. The Dutch must flow.
Yeah. And so, as we know, it came from sandworms.
Right.
In the Indies.
In Arrakis.
Yeah.
East
Arrakis, Indies.
Yeah.
Same thing. Columbus arrived at Arrakis and he called it India.
Yeah, so that brings us actually to what a lot of people are, I should say, I think a lot of white people are not really aware of, which is weird because it's like half their fucking
That spices are good because all they eat is mayonnaise.
Well, there's that. Fuck mayonnaise.
They think salt is too spicy.
Oh my god. And believe me, it destroys me every day when I have to deal with this bullshit.
Yeah, I was talking about this with Diane, and I brought up this joke that I saw on Twitter that was like, I can't believe that the Europeans destroyed and enslaved the world for spices, and now they don't even eat spicy food.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It galls me. Yeah.
Oh man.
Oh my god.
Laughing to keep from crying.
Oh, yep. They say that if you smile, then you won't have a panic attack. And that's basically
not true.
What I've been doing. Yeah, no, I know it's not true. Like, ha 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 ha.
Why was the spice trade so important?
Let's go down to the spice notes. Yeah. So as I mentioned,
So let's get my dumb guy theory out of the way, and then we'll go into your actual knowledge that you probably have.
Sure.
So my guess is maybe it was the best way to capture excess capital. Capital for military development probably had some pretty hard limits in terms of how many soldiers could be controlled and fed, and how much industry could be dedicated to it. So the sources of spices were that doesn't make sense. That's just a fun fact. So basically my idea was maybe it was a way to expend all the excess capital that the upper class had, because spices were basically for the upper class for the most part.
Right. Yeah, it was any kind of exotic trade, quote unquote, is a trickle down situation.
Yeah.
Pretty much ever since ever. Unfortunately for the rest of us, So
Right.
once they've mastered it and they want to just make more money, then they'll let the rest of us have it. Right. Did you have any other thoughts on the control of capital or anything like that?
No, but I will add that on the subject of rich versus poor people getting it, nutmeg was one of the spices that was traded by the VOC, and the example of the closest thing to commoners using nutmeg is honestly infuriating. Monks would sprinkle it into their peas porridge to spice it up a little bit.
Spicing their porridge.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I mean,
putting it into fucking 9-day-old food.
Right.
Assholes.
Fucking. I mean, if you ever had that apple cinnamon oatmeal, that's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
Although that's a refinement of the idea.
Right.
But also, monks, man. So.
And now people just put in their damn cappuccinos. What's up with that?
Pumpkin spice.
Yeah.
They don't realize they're guzzling fucking fermented horse cum or something, which is what that really is. I just want you all to know that before the police take me away. Oh my god, I'm being dragged away. It's just horse cum. Oh my god. Oh shit. Oh fuck. Ah. Okay. Anyway, I'm back. The Dutch interest in the spice trade was parallel to basically everyone's interest in trade with Asia that they could not otherwise access because of the political economic history of Euro-Asian relations, partly due to Christian-Islamic relations,
as we mentioned earlier,
among other things, right?
Yeah.
Like indigenously, in the land, Europe is it can grow crops, it can grow trees, it can grow barbarians,
Yeah.
but it can't grow shit else. No offense to my ancestors.
Hey,
or
they
their
got
cousins.
capers.
They got
It's a great
capers.
spice.
They got capers.
Everyone's favorite.
Yeah, you got to pickle them, but whatever.
Yeah, everyone loves when they get capers on a sandwich.
Yeah,
That's
everyone
the best
pickle
shit.
everything. Yeah, everyone just So Asia had an abundance of spices, and they also, for a very fucking long time, had the trade routes and other infrastructure to support a thriving spice trade.
Yeah.
This also applies to the things like silk and porcelain that I mentioned before too. The Silk Roads were both land and sea. It was not so much a sort of a single complex of overland routes as it was like a massive set of circuits.
And the Silk Roads were established by the Mongols, right?
The Silk Roads were securitized.
Secured? Okay.
Yeah, secured and protected by the Mongols.
Okay.
So what happened is the Silk Roads had been around for fucking forever.
Yeah.
And they were more than just silk. Yeah, they were called the Silk Roads because of like European views of Asia, and because silk was a long-running hot commodity that like even the fucking ancient Romans were really like gunning for, and like which they got from the Chinese via the Silk Roads. And there was like toward the end of like Roman antiquity, there was even an diplomatic mission, between the Romans and the Chinese. And
so the Silk Road is where you use the Bitcoin that your monks created to buy drugs, right?
Right, drugs and underage prostitutes. Yes,
right,
that's
okay.
correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And you use one on the other. I can't remember how it goes, but yeah. So the Silk Roads were both land and sea, and the land one is the one we tend to know more, which is like it goes from basically like various points of China, production centers, etc., across China, from east to west, through Central Asia, among the various passes, in those mountains and steppes and plateaus, through Iran, through like Samarkand, and so forth. A lot of the stands as we know them now, and then all the way to the Levant, to Asia Minor, and so forth. So, and Arabia. So that was an extremely kind of mutually enriching complex of trade, which no single power controlled.
Okay.
Right? And this is key. No single power controlled the Silk Road on land, and no single power controlled the Silk Road on sea.
Right, because it was based on Bitcoin, which is decentralized.
Right. A bunch of monks getting approved by their religious leader. Yeah. So the Maritime Route was basically from like the Chinese coast. I can't remember exactly where it technically ends, but it did basically trade up to Japan. So we could just pretend that it went all the way to Japan.
Shanghai.
Yeah, it's like Shanghai, Japan, etc.
Yeah.
That whole area, Sea of Japan and East China. And it's sort of, that was the one bookend, and it went all the way down through Southeast Asia, through the Malacca Strait, the Malay Peninsula, and Sumatra and Java, all the way west up through what we now call Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, all the way up India again into like past what we now call Somalia and Iran and the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and Egypt, more or less. So massive.
There was no like channel
network
from the Mediterranean to like the Indian Ocean, right?
Not yet.
Okay.
So it was reliant on, at this point, if you were in...
So you had to go over land to get to the Mediterranean?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so it was like this. The land routes were good because as long as you had the land access, you could go kind of anywhere.
Okay.
Right, because that's where humans live.
Yeah.
Generally. But the sea routes were also faster, typically. Yeah. And like...
you could haul way more shit.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that technically it was maybe like 50% or even 100% longer than the land routes overall because you were seeing so much coast.
Right.
And so the maritime routes were like really great, but they were controlled by the land access in the Middle Eastern and North African region because there was no Mediterranean to Indian Ocean.
Which means the Muslims.
Exactly. So once the Muslims took over, the Abbasids and so forth, once they got all that area, then they were in this key position, which is like, for them, pretty cool.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, shit, like Islam and riches. Nice, not bad. And this is actually, I think, one reason that the Arabs were originally successful merchants even before Islam.
Yeah.
It's because they're on this really strategically located peninsula where they can just be like, all right, we'll take it from here, So, anyway, the Muslims in the 700s began to expand after the death of Muhammad, and after that, they encountered in the east, the Tang dynasty, who was trying to... So geographically, the Abbasids were moving east from Arabia and the Levant. The Tang dynasty was moving west from like Xinjiang, which is western China. And they met with all their different allies through some political finagling in the Battle of Talas, which is famous for, again, Asian studies types, but which most people have no fucking idea about.
Yeah, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's a really crucial battle which resulted in this kind of balance of power in that area.
Okay.
Where the Tang dynasty were defeated technically, but they both kind of saw that like the Abbasids had no real point at that point in moving east into Chinese desert, and the Chinese knew that the Abbasids were too powerful to push west from there. And it was too costly to move over the desert into that area again. Okay, so the Tang dynasty got their asses whooped by the Abbasids, and this is actually the point at which a bunch of the Turkic peoples became
This must be why
Muslims.
they're doing the whole Xinjiang thing.
Yeah,
doing the ethnic cleansing of the...
Actually,
yeah.
so this led to the incursion of the Uyghurs and
the Uyghurs,
into Xinjiang in that area. And the Uyghurs were some of these Turkic peoples who were converted to Islam through that kind of course of events, because they're like, oh, the Abbasids are kind of badass, let's become Muslims,
Yeah.
Like, cool. And so forth. Right, so this had massive repercussions for a variety of reasons. Getting back to the point, what it led to is that the Tang dynasty realized they'd have overextended themselves, and they began to kind of turn inward for a little while. This led to a disruption of the overland Silk Road. Okay. Right? And so, again, people, this is in the 700s, but it's important, right? So the Tang dynasty did that. So this resulted in Silk Road merchants turning to the alternate routes along the Maritime Silk Road, energized that over... in preference to, the land road. And the Maritime Silk Road, again, spans from all the way from nearly Japan, basically, all the way around to Persia and Arabia. So we see a precedent in that era for these ancient sea routes and systems creating mutual enrichment of all these different societies along the way. But unlike the Phoenician thalassocracy, which we discussed, these societies were ethnically distinct in most cases. They were generally autonomous. They had different religions and political worries. So there was no single permanent hegemon when it came to control of distribution, which is one of our favorite themes. Yeah. And so cultural and mercantile exchanges were also not especially extractive. Like extraction maybe occurred on a local level, no big surprise, but it was not extractive in the way that the colonial systems would be later. So
they were kind of like skimming off the top and not so much.
It was like more what merchants traditionally did before capitalism, right? So then you see later in the roughly 12 to 1300s, the Mongols up in the north of China, they take over China. They took over a bunch of like the Middle East. And the Mongols were, in some ways, horrifically brutal, but in other ways, they were extremely humane. They created like standardized currencies, standardized roads. They created a system of security called the Pax Mongolica in sort of English historical terms, in which it was said, I think that the proverb or the adage was like, a virgin with a basket of gold on her head could cross from one side of the empire to another without being harmed.
Wow.
Like, people were like, they trusted it that much because the Mongols would fuck you up if you didn't let them go.
Nice.
Right? So this was very important, and this actually led to a lot of the exchange of goods and ideas in the Middle Ages that enriched Europe because they were like, well, the Mongols scare the fuck out of us and we don't like them very much, but they're also ensuring that things kind of get through to us.
Yeah.
So we'll trade with them. We'll get that stuff and we know it'll happen. Right. So then historical processes happened. Also spices began to flow, right?
Yeah.
So Western buyers, if they had access to these routes, could access exotic spices that the Mongols could access. And of course, any trader worth their salt, if you will, would trade salt and spices, right, along these routes. But then, by the way, the Black Death, which we saw in the 1300s, came from Mongol, we believe, military units who moved westward from somewhere in the steppe into the Middle East, and then the rats that came on their baggage trains and stuff boarded Italian ships that went to Italy. Those rats had the bubonic plague. That spread the Black Death into Europe. At the same time...
And the main reason that the Black Death was so devastating was because of concentrated populations.
Exactly.
It only hit state peoples.
Europeans were beginning to urbanize and statify,
Yeah. I don't think we've mentioned this very much at all, but like... prior really to the modern age, states were pretty transient because they could just be wiped out by disease
very
because
quickly.
They were very concentrated. You had to have a concentrated population to have a state. And so if anyone got a disease, they didn't have much in the way of medicine, so it would just kill everyone.
Yeah. So this was an era in which states were becoming more stable, partly due to that.
Yeah.
But then this massive pandemic happens, partly because, again, of the ability of people to move securely from one location to like 2,000 or 3,000 miles away because of the Mongol security regime. So that era and that devastation led to a collapse of the regimes and the security apparatus in the 14th century, which in any given system, whether it's, mercantilist or feudalist or capitalist or any system, that'll lead to price spikes, lost access, limited access between various regions. So because trade falters, which means that like anything will get under or
it gets distributed to rich people first.
Exactly, right. People with power, or it just doesn't get distributed at all. Right. So the first person who can find it suddenly has hit the jackpot. Or they get torn apart limb from limb. And so
that one sounds pretty good to me.
Right, exactly. So then, because history moves faster than human lives, in a strange kind of way, the 15th century saw Europeans going, well, that sucked, what do we do now? And by this point, the collapse of the Mongol regimes had led to enabled a rise in Islamic regimes again in the Middle East and Asia Minor. This was the fall of the Byzantines finally. This was all sorts of stuff. And so the kind of Christian Europe war, they basically now had to deal with a mass of Islamic regimes and merchants controlling all that land access to both the land and sea routes of the Silk Road, right? So this is where we're getting that political economic... this is where international relations comes back in, right? Where you're like, what's the balance of power? What's the sort of geopolitical, geoeconomic lay of the land, if you will, or mapping? And they just literally, they could not get the shit they wanted that they developed tastes for. And so they're like, oh, fuck. And because it was, quote unquote Christian Europe versus quote unquote like the Islamosphere, and at that point they'd become political enemies because of other things, the Crusades. The Europeans were really unwilling to deal with Islamic merchants, right? They just didn't want to make political concessions to them, let alone trade concessions. And so, there was a little bit.
And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the
the
Catholic Church.
Exactly, right? By that point, the Catholic Church was entrenched. Right. And so...
And by the way, for most of this period, the Europeans were backwards dirt people.
Yes.
They were the scum of the fucking earth.
Terrible. Semi-cannibals.
Brutal. Just awful backwards people. Didn't know how to do math or...
It was pretty bad.
Write numbers down or navigate any of that shit. I mean... Like, it was Columbus Day recently.
Oh my God! Yeah,
There was that PragerU thing with Steven Crowder saying that Columbus was a great navigator. He was a fucking moron.
He was a moron.
He had no fucking idea what he was doing.
We're about to touch on that, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
so
great.
the 15th century, one of the reasons that this Columbus guy got shit for anything is because the Euros were desperate to find a different way to trade with Asia because they didn't want to deal with the Muslims because of all this bullshit. And so they began to look for like ways around. And they're like, well, let's look at the Greek theory we've sorely misunderstood, And so this is the point at which like they began to look out for sort of opportunistic and desperate forays, which were ultimately the only reason, or nearly the only reason, that the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British were able to ever become global powers, right? Like, they were regional powers, sure, or they were kind of, up-and-comers, but this blue water navigation that they just kind of started to figure out how to do, which is like...
Which the only reason they knew this is because they got the knowledge from the Muslims.
Exactly, which is so bizarre, right? And so
the Muslims had estimated the circumference of the Earth like hundreds of years before them. They understood that the Earth was round hundreds of years before them, and so they were able to draw these maps that had the curvature of the Earth factored in so that they could actually navigate across a long ocean without any like idea where they were actually headed.
Exactly. And so they managed to like steal and or use some of that knowledge to get into deep water. And Columbus was one of the guys who was like, I kind of figured this out, but his circle wasn't big enough.
Yeah.
So that's how he was like, oh yeah, if I just sail this many weeks or months west, I'll hit India and Indonesia.
Yeah, the other day I heard that he thought that Asia was 3,500 miles away from Europe. Yeah. So, really brilliant, genius navigator.
Yeah, he not only undershot that, but he crossed the smaller ocean.
Yeah.
Like he only crossed the Atlantic and found land and was nearly about to die and didn't have any idea what the Pacific actually looked like, which is massive. So let's see. Back to so the Europeans were like looking for these sea routes. They basically wanted to monopolize the distribution of Asian goods to European buyers and vice versa, because they understood the power of the Silk Road network that pre-existed, right? Okay. So they didn't invent this shit. This is another thing that like people take credit for, but they never actually created. They just kind of like were like, well, that existed before. Let's do our version of it.
Yeah.
It's like Google and Google Earth. You're
right.
Like, well, it sort of was already there.
Yeah.
And they just kind of like perfected it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Dutch did their little thing. They went around Africa to Southeast Asia. They found Sumatra and Java. Early Dutch contacts with Javanese societies and kingdoms were not altogether fruitful, but after a little while, they did find one regional leader who was willing to let them land their ships and set up a permanent post in what we call Banten in Java, which is where bantam roosters come from, basically.
Okay.
So it's like it's the same kind of name. But eventually, again, as with the Phoenicians, like one wasn't enough. Once you pop, you can't stop. And mercantile interests, as is typical in these situations, soon necessitated military protection and political games.
Okay.
So the Dutch, they got their little, land colony on the edge of the island, and they started to trade locally. But I think partly because of the expense, partly because of security risks, and partly because of their competition with the Portuguese, who were at that time a big deal, right? And who were also in the area.
Yeah.
And then the British were trying to, edge in. They started to have to play games with the other colonizing powers using local proxies.
Right.
Right. So that led to the Dutch essentially making deals, breaking deals, just like the, colonists in North America did often, right? Oh, we'll have a treaty with you. Mostly because we can use that against our opponents.
Right.
Right. And then we'll break the treaty as soon as you're weak and we're strong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they kept doing that.
So one particularly awful example of the VOC's operations was the one on the archipelago called Banda. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Banda's good. Yeah,
okay,
that's good.
Which at the time was the world's only source of nutmeg and mace. So if you don't know, nutmeg and mace both come from the same fruit, the nutmeg fruit. The nutmeg is the seed and mace is the rind. If you ever want to use it in cooking, mace is like a more delicate version of nutmeg. It's pretty nice.
A little milder.
So the Europeans wanted to control the trade of nutmeg, so they could put it in their fucking peas porridge or whatever the fuck.
Right. Put so in cookies.
Yeah. So in the 16th century, the Portuguese conquered Malacca, which was an important trading hub for nutmeg. And by the way, like, I don't know if we've emphasized this enough, but like, the source of spices was kept very secret.
Yeah.
And spices themselves were shrouded in myth.
Yep.
So traders would come back with spices and they would like tell tales about them.
Oh yeah, it comes from this dragon's hoard that I dug up.
Yeah, so the places were kept secret, and so like European colonizers were trying to find the sources of the spices so that they could just take control of them and monopolize the trade.
Yep. And this is like it's a good way to kind of think about the early inclusion of like the whole idea of trade secrets.
Yes.
You know, in competition in particular.
Yeah.
Where it's like you don't just want to trade, you want to keep everything secret. You want to make sure that nobody can even find the shit you're using, so you can again secure that monopoly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also like on the reverse, like the quest for knowledge that we kind of associate with Europeans was really a brutal colonial project.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, the Europeans were constantly they were on a long quest to like find the source of the spices. The Portuguese got kind of close. They found Malacca, which was like one of the biggest trading hubs for nutmeg.
Yep.
And they conquered that. Malacca's now in Malaysia. Well, it's in the same spot as it was back then.
Yeah,
but it's in what is now Malaysia. So the VOC wanted to control like the source itself. So it made a lot of effort to learn the location of the Banda Islands. So historians aren't sure whether they like basically tortured people to like get the location and get them to drive them there, or if they found someone who was like willing to do it.
Right.
Either one is possible because both happened in colonial projects, throughout history. Yeah,
there was a lot of very vicious suppression.
Yeah.
As well as like cutthroat competition, depending on who they were.
Right. Yeah. So they basically got some Indonesian people to help them navigate to the Banda Islands. And so I think at first what they did was they set up a treaty with one of the local leaders, and it basically said we'll get rid of the Portuguese if you let us buy your spices. And so they were thankful at first, and then almost immediately
Devil's bargain.
Yeah, they started just murdering people. So they
Eiffel Tower.
all told, they killed or sold off into slavery 14,000 Bandanese people, which was over 90% of the population of the islands.
Yeah, again, those couple of islands or a few islands is like, I've flown over them and they're not large. Like,
yeah, it's a tiny look it up on a map. It's a tiny archipelago.
Yeah, it's just that
the total population was 15,000.
Yeah,
so it was not very big at all.
Yeah, that part of Indonesia it's a bunch of islands, but they're all very small. It'd be like being on Molokai or something in Hawaii.
Yeah,
it's very small.
So needless to say, they got the monopoly they wanted. So they controlled it for a long time. At one point, the British, also trying to gain control of the nutmeg trade, negotiated a monopoly with another Bandanese leader. But in 1667, they traded it to the Dutch for control of Manhattan, the island in New York.
Never heard of that place.
Later, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch Empire went through an interregnum, which is basically like a period where the state doesn't really exercise much control.
Yeah. Interregnum is
understand
basically
correctly.
typically it's like you said, like there may be a government, there may not be in action, but there's no official like
they were tied up in other matters.
Autocrat or something. Yeah, exactly.
So during the Interregnum, the British went and cut down some of the nutmeg trees, and they transplanted them to countries near Indonesia, like
Those
Sri Lanka
bastards.
and Malaysia, in order to break the monopoly.
Right.
So that was actually the smart strategy.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, why you've
Probably
got
could have
it.
avoided this whole situation if the locals had just done that. But
Right, but they had no scope outside of their own island, which
Right.
is the issue.
yeah. Let's not blame them though.
Yeah.
So that's what I have for that section. Pretty awful shit.
Yeah, the Spice Islands are, again, I've mentioned, twice now, 3 times that I've flown over the Banda Islands. The Spice Islands in Maluku are basically where I grew up in the first, third of my life. And there's a ton of spices there. I mean, they have cinnamon.
Some shit we've never even heard of.
Yeah, they have, well, among other things. They have, let's see. All right, so the Spice Islands that we've been talking about briefly, in this area, again, we mentioned nutmeg, which is a big fucking deal. Yeah. Cinnamon is a big fucking deal. They grow that. And
nutmeg, as we all know, is when a soccer ball goes between your legs.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. That's what happens. And then you regret everything. Also, cloves and mace, and allspice, I suppose.
Yeah.
So these are, this
all the
is
stuff you need for good garam masala.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These are things that maybe don't fill out your entire spice cabinet now.
Yeah.
But that's because we live in an era where we get spices everywhere.
Spoiled motherfuckers. Yeah, I was saying this when we were outside on a break. I think it's pretty interesting and maybe not funny because it involved mass death, but back then
Shrug.
we had very nutritious food that didn't taste very good, and now we have really non-nutritious food that tastes really good.
Yeah.
So if you're poor, you put spices in your food to make it taste better.
Right.
And if you're rich, you get really nutritious food.
Legit good. But
Yeah.
And so the Spice Islands, like, they produce a lot, especially for the time.
Did they have peppers? Do you know? Did they have peppers in Europe, or was that also an Asian thing?
Well,
I know there's a lot of specific pepper breeds.
I was going to say there's different kinds of peppers, obviously. Right. Like chili peppers, as we know it, come from the Americas.
Okay.
Right. But they were rapidly brought over to Southeast Asia to grow.
Okay.
Right. So that's where you get like Thai.
So like Thai chilies
Malay
did come
chilies.
from.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. All that shit, all that good shit.
So what about like bell peppers though?
That's like a mutation of those same peppers.
Okay.
As I recall.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So like now a lot of Southeast Asian cuisine is based on things that were brought over through the colonial system from other colonies, right? They've integrated things like peanuts and potatoes and tomatoes and chili peppers in with things that were indigenous to them, like other kinds of potatoes, coconut, obviously, and various kinds of like indigenous vegetables, fruits, leaves, etc. Yeah, and proteins.
Kratom, all that stuff.
Exactly, right. So a lot of what you consider to be like, authentic Southeast Asian cuisine, which is delicious, is, well, I hate to say it. It's like Italian food. It's a sort of a post-colonial invention. It's like a fusion food.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's kind of what makes it brilliant, is that it was, much of it at least, was invented by the people who were from there, working with the things that were now being imported or even planted in their own backyard for the profit of the colonists. And so they just worked with it, and they made beautiful things out of it. So the resilience of humankind, hey-o. moving on from getting pleasure from pain. Well, really, like at this point, we should close it out because like after the VOC took over what we now call Indonesia, more or less, through their process of kind of playing people against each other, taking over different ports, mobilizing different militaries, often local militaries against each other. So like they'd play a kingdom against another kingdom, and then they'd take over both. That kind of shit.
One other thing I can talk about briefly. I didn't write anything down about it, but I skimmed through this paper because I was trying to see. I thought of a question, which was like how many like hours of labor could they mobilize?
We were wondering about that.
With the expenditures they had available to them, and I never found the answer to that. But I did find this fairly interesting paper that talked about like they basically studied a sample of workers in the VOC and how they advanced through the company. And they also kind of mapped out like the structure of the company itself, so that there was different sectors. So they had a military sector, a maritime sector, and a civil sector. And the civil sector was like the highest one. So basically, the maritime sector, you could you start off as like a seaman, and then you could move up to eventually being a captain. That was like the highest rank in the maritime sector. In the military sector, they had different ranks there. Okay. I didn't pay attention quite to that, to the different rankings there. But basically, if you wanted to advance past the military or maritime sectors, you would go into the civil sector, and eventually you would get to the like governing board or whatever it was called.
Right. Right.
And
corporate ladder shit.
Yeah, and it much resembled moving up the corporate ladder today.
Right. It's kind of the granddaddy of corporate theory. Yeah, just like their operations, their structure, and their mission. To kind of take all and win all. Yeah. Basically what we have today.
Yeah. That's all I had for that, really.
Yeah. It basically explains, the origins and the current state of things.
Right.
But eventually, of course, it couldn't help, like any state or quasi-state, to basically stumble over something.
So do you want to take the downfall part?
Sure, I'll just go with it. So the VOC was after something like nearly 200 years, roughly 200 years. VOC was nationalized in 1796. This was kind of an accident of history.
Okay.
They were doing okay for a long time. They lasted 200 years, not out of just chance.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that doesn't mean that they were actually doing morally good business, but they were doing effective business. Right. So, but among other things, there was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in the early 1780s, and that had cost the VOC quite a bit. Basically, they just couldn't handle all the costs. They couldn't handle all the logistics. And then within another 5 years or so, the French Revolution happens, and if any of you is familiar with the continental effects of the French Revolution, it's not really surprising that their little neighbor in Amsterdam would be affected by this. So basically, the French, by 1795, were aggressively spreading all their kind of radical views, their revolutionary Republican views, and in so doing, they were actively restructuring the landscape of European politics, right? And this is one reason why European powers were at war with them, is because all these fucking monarchists were like, oh, we can't have people being equal to each other. That sucks, So, right? So, hilariously, though, the Netherlands had at least some significant population of people who were sort of sympathetic to Republican or enlightened liberal ideas at the time.
Okay.
So they were like, oh, well, the French are kind of trying to equalize people in some way or another, and we like that enough that we'll kind of collaborate with them. And so when the French invaded, then they found some sympathizers in Amsterdam they successfully installed this kind of French-aligned Batavian Republic,
Okay.
which is...
And Batavia was what they called Jakarta.
Right.
Yeah.
So they called... Yeah, so Jakarta we kind of skipped over briefly, but it's like not a big deal. It's
just the capital.
It's just the capital of Indonesia.
Whatever. Who gives a fuck?
Right. So Jakarta was this decently significant port at first, and now it's like this massive metropolis. But they named Jakarta Batavia when they took it over and colonized it.
Jakarta's such a better name.
I agree.
Jakarta's one of my favorite names for a place, I think.
Jakarta is a better name than the city is.
Okay.
like I lived in Jakarta for a year, and like there's some cool shit there, and like obviously the people in the city, you know, there's a lot of good people there. But the city as a whole is just like a fucking mess. It's just awful. It stinks, and traffic is like it takes you an hour to go like a kilometer.
Oh,
it's
okay.
Fucking bad.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's still like that, apparently.
Wow.
According to some other people I've talked to recently.
Damn.
Yeah, it's fucking pathetic. But that's where they run their country from. So they renamed it Batavia or Batavia after this kind of even pre-medieval like antiquity tribe, ancient tribe that the Romans had encountered up in that area. So it was this kind of mythical name for like a Germanic or Germano-Celtic group of people in Europe. For some reason, they named Jakarta that. But then, when the French invaded Amsterdam, 200 years after they took over Jakarta.
Yeah.
When the French invaded Amsterdam, they were like, oh, let's have this fancy republic. And they renamed themselves, the Netherlands, the Batavian Republic. That republic, then basically absorbed the VOC, and because of reasons, they let the charter run out in 1799.
Okay.
So the VOC was already kind of like weakened by these previous wars with the British, with others, and then
can't even trade any nutmeg anymore.
Right, and the French just kind of like showed up. They're like, you're all fucking Republicans now, and we're talking the Republicans in the political science,
right.
sense.
Yeah.
And then the Republic just was like, all right, like we nationalized it, and fuck it, like why would we let it have its own charter anymore?
Yeah.
Let it run out. So then after the Napoleonic Wars kind of came and went over the next decade or two. Then the Brits kind of took over the former VOC's currently Dutch colonial infrastructure and kind of did their own thing. And it's funny because the Brits were always like lusting for that region.
Yeah.
The Brits and the Portuguese and the Dutch had traditionally competed a lot in like the Malay region, which is one reason why the Brits colonized Malaysia, created Singapore out of almost nothing, and had and claimed part
Burma,
of Borneo.
right, too?
Borneo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then the Portuguese had a variety of other like port colonies, including what is now Timor-Leste. But that's also complicated Indonesian history. So after the Napoleonic Wars ended, the Brits kind of like, okay, we'll assume control over this and like, rub their grubby little hands together. But after that, they kind of did some administrative things, and the Dutch kind of took it all back again because of this kind of cascade effect of political seizures. And so basically, the VOC kind of formally disappeared. But really what had happened is the Dutch had achieved their big goal, which was to create a projection of the state, create power through that.
Okay.
The VOC had served its purpose. Now, through war and accident, the VOC had become nationalized.
Okay.
And then given away and then handed back to the Dutch government. But now the Dutch government was now just officially a colonial power instead of like a shell company.
Okay.
Right? So then Dutch colonialism went strong for another century or so, up until basically the Japanese occupation of Indonesia.
Okay.
Right? So At least in that region, right?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting look at how this kind of corporatist formal organization works, how it's kind of nimble and cynical and extremely politically involved.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's another thing I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier, but I mean, I didn't look if there were other examples of this around the same time, but the VOC probably had one of the most recognizable brands for a long time. They had, like, their logo was like the letters VOC.
Right.
And
very
I didn't even realize that I recognized it, but like when I saw the logo, I was like, oh, I've seen this before.
Yeah.
So like, there's like all these like porcelain products and stuff that are still around that have the VOC logo on them. So like prior to, you know, the modern era where we have, you know, children recognize like 200 different types of brands.
It's like Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
VOC.
Yeah, it was a very recognizable brand. So that's another interesting connection to the modern time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, is that all we have?
Well, I can't think of anything else. You know,
it's random shit sprinkled around, but I don't think it's anything important. And not anything we could really
nothing we
dedicate a section on.
No. Everything that we just talked about in our patchy, disjointed way has its own like subtopic that you should totally look into.
Yeah, we could honestly have stretched this out to like 10 episodes. Probably.
Whether like we actually had a hard time like concentrating everything into one or two episodes for this, because whether it's like metal and currency, or like spice as a commodity, and like where spices come from and why people care about it, and like who the Dutch were, why European versus, you know, like Asian trade routes, blah 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 blah. You know, it's a huge topic, and I think it's one reason why it's so sort of intensively studied.
Right. So I guess for conclusions from this, again, businesses are intimately part of the state. Right.
They feed off of each other.
Yeah.
And they imitate each other.
This is a model of a modern corporation.
Oh, yeah.
The only real difference is like, besides technology, obviously, modern corporations, there's like one thing that I haven't really gotten into that could be a decent episode topic to get into is a big part of statecraft is standardization.
Oh yeah, that's huge.
Yeah,
that's one reason the writing comes in.
Like for example, modern shipping, which we'll get into in the Maersk episode. So I can expand on this later. But the reason that global trade has exploded so much is not because of any particular technological innovation in terms of like, oh, now we have these super efficient engines, or now we have these like computerized systems to blah blah blah.
Right.
It's literally because we now have containerized shipping. So instead of trying to fill a ship up to the gills, you just put it all in boxes.
Yep.
And then you pick the boxes with a crane and move it onto the ship.
Exactly.
And it makes everything really simple to manage.
Yep.
That's the thing, is like, you need standardization to manage things effectively. So the real difference between the VOC back then and modern corporations today is that we have standardized the process of creating a limited liability company that can operate multinationally.
Right.
Like every nation has like a law that allows someone to start a corporation, and if they are able to build it up, which basically depends on them serving the interests of the state that it's based in, then anyone can start their own part of the state. And both the legal structure and the way that money works ensures basically that it will uphold the state's interests in one way or another.
Right.
Either directly by building, military implements or supplying it with resources, or indirectly by serving its employees like with coffee shops or fast food restaurants or whatever.
Right.
I guess that's all I have. I can't think of anything else.
I mean, I don't know what else there is to say about this one.
Yeah,
You know.
I mean, there's a lot more we could say if we did more research, but we didn't because at some point you got to quit.
Yep. We've been talking a while.
Yeah, we're both pretty tired. So, if you enjoyed this episode, once again, I'm Ryan Salisbury.
Chris Nivens.
Yeah, Chris Nivens.
We found on Twitter.
Right. I'm at Handle of Rye. Chris is at Solidarity_Goth.
Yep.
Our podcast is at NeighborSci Pod on Twitter, Neighbor Science on Facebook, Neighbor Science on Patreon, and Neighbor Science on Instagram. Our website is neighborscience.podbean.com. I'm gonna get a domain name eventually. I always put off
Well, you
purchases.
don't like podbean.com?
I always put off purchases as long as possible. Like I have a lot in savings just because like anytime I think of buying something, I'm like, I don't need it right now. So like
You're better than I am.
I only recently got rid of some jeans that I had since I was 18 years old. I'm 29 right now. So I had them for over a decade, and it's mostly because I don't like buying shit.
Yeah, I mean, I get it.
So I've been procrastinating on buying the domain name, but I will do it eventually. Hopefully, no one scoops it up from me. Someone who wants Neighbor Science podcast or something like that. Jeez,
they kill 15,000 domain names to get yours.
God. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, once again, if you sign up for our Patreon, any amount over $1 or more, and you can listen to any content we clip out, which is usually extra stories about stuff that's happening to us, or me saying something racist, and the pre-show chats that us warming up, talking about whatever is happening at the time. So check that out.
Sometimes it's actually good.
Yeah, once in a while. And our next episode on this topic is going to be about Maersk, the modern Danish shipping company. So that should be interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Well.
Bye.
Bye.